Hi there, welcome to another one of Javelin Wealth Management's 20 Conversations. We've been having these conversations with some really interesting people over the last few months, aiming to commemorate Javelin's 20th year in business. We've been talking on thematics, everything from a hike that I did across Spain a year ago, and talked about the reasons for the art of the sabbatical. We've talked to people who have insights into AI. They have insights into branding, and we've even covered esoteric subjects like glamping and the future of travel in the new era. Today, however, we're very fortunate to have with us Shreya Rao. She is a fantastic lawyer based in India who is a graduate of Harvard Law School and just for fun is also doing a part-time PhD at Oxford because she hasn't got quite enough to do already. So welcome, Shreya. Maybe you'd like to start off by just giving us a little bit of an introduction to you, what you do, and what it means for you to run your own business now.
Sure. Thanks, Steve, and thanks for having me here. I think I'll have a hard time matching up to the excitement quotient of some of the topics you mentioned before, glamping and trips across Spain and whatnot, but I'm going to try my best to do so. I run my own law practice in India. And one of the things that I focus on is private client work. So I do a lot of work with high net worth individuals and business families in India. This is a fairly niche area, at least in the Indian context. So in the form that it is understood world over, it's only about 15 or 20 years old. And I'd like to think that I've been around for as long as the practice has been taking shape. So now as an entrepreneur, it's essentially the idea is to give it a vision and shape that I think could be could match global standards. That's really what I'm trying to do.
Fantastic. I mean, Javelin, we've been investing in a lot of markets around the world, and obviously India is a market that we've recently increased our allocations to on the basis of the fact that it looks as though perhaps finally it's achieving its potential and rapid growth, deregulation, and everything. Perhaps you could give us a little bit of an introduction to what's been happening, why India seems to be the flavor of the month, and whether or not you think that's going to continue.
Over the years, there's been a gradual movement towards some form of deregulation. So, for example, one of the biggest questions that we get on the advisory side is from families who want to make investments outside India. And at this moment, or at least until very recently, it used to be very hard. So because India has foreign exchange regulations in place, there were essentially three routes under which money could go out from India. One was the liberalized remittance scheme route available to individuals. One was the overseas direct investment route available to companies. And the third was the overseas direct investment approval route, also available to certain kinds of companies. Now, all of these routes came with their own terms and conditions. They were not fully they did not fully meet up to the hopes of families in terms of what they wanted to invest in. And there we have seen some deregulation in the recent past in the form of gift city structures, where Indian families who set up entities in gift are at least theoretically able to do a lot more than they were able to under the previous rules. Where is India on the global stage? What kinds of businesses are being set up? And I think that's a very different question from deregulation.
Yeah.
And I grew up in the 90s in India. And all of the businesses that you were seeing set up in the 90s and early 2000s were still the tech services for overseas customers. So your business process outsourcing entities and those kinds of businesses. And we did see a lot of success there. But I think over the last decade or so, what has happened is we're seeing a lot of SaaS-based businesses being set up, very successful ones. We're increasingly developing into a product nation. And I think in the next 10 years, we're going to see generative AI and large language modules and things like that becoming a lot more talked about because there is a lot of buzz around that area, particularly where I am in Bangalore.
Yes.
Actually, a fun story about this transition that I think sort of demonstrates how the switch happened. So we have, there's this company called Freshdesk, which is now a NASDAQ listed company, got $1 billion valuation, made a lot of millionaires in India and so on. But in the early days of Freshdesk, there used to be a competitor company called Zendesk, which was not an Indian entity.
Yeah.
And the person running Zendesk at some point put up some tweets saying these folks from, and this is all in the public domain. So, I mean, it's none of it is personal to me. But he put up some tweets saying that, oh, look at Freshdesk. It's all these Indian cowboys. They're essentially copying stuff is what the broad point was. And the Freshdesk CEO also put up a public post saying that if you think that's what we're doing, why don't I give you a free trial? Why don't you try out what we're building and then come back to us and tell us how good our product is?
I'm interested from the point of view of families and private wealth. So that therefore has meant that, as you said, traditional wealth, so old money, as it might be referred to perhaps in the UK, and new money, so all of the tech wealth that has been created, and as you say, some fantastic businesses which have grown very, very rapidly. In your position as a lawyer working for these types of families on both sides of the sort of that wealth paradigm historically, what differences have you found between traditional and new? How do they approach it? Are they very different in terms of the way that they look at wealth and what they want to do with it? Or is there a sort of emerging, becoming more evident?
I mean, the first thing to keep in mind is that none of these categories are monoliths. There is a saying that gets bandied around in the context of India a lot, which irritates me, but I think it's there because it's true, which is that everything that you can say of India, the opposite is equally true. And that's true of the families that you work with as well, which is that everything you say about one or the other category of family, the opposite is equally true. Of course, this divide between old money and new money is actually, it tells a broader story, right? So the story of old money is that these are businesses that were set up long ago, usually the brick and mortar businesses. Many have now grown into conglomerates, operate within family structures, which can be very large family structures, which are joint family structures where the whole family is involved. And that also used to say certain things about the way in which corporate governance used to run in the business. So I think one of the biggest pushes that has come for personal planning on the Indian side is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, which was introduced a few years ago. And on the face of it, it has nothing to do with families. But the real story was it did have a lot to do with families, because the way in which these businesses, the old school businesses used to often run is that they would not segregate the business from the personal. So the family would put in everything that they had into the business, and the business would pay for the personal expenses of the family. And so that segregation was never maintained. What this meant is that when loans were taken at the business level, there was also this practice of evergreening of loans. So you would take one loan and then you would take another loan to sort of pay off the previous one. What the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code did is it introduced a set of creditor-friendly provisions, which made it easier for creditors to proceed against these businesses. And then suddenly a bulb went off inside the minds of all these families, right? They said that if this is no longer creditor protected, then we need our own nest egg. And that's when they started thinking about family offices. I think with the newer generation, what happens is that they start off with very little. Many of them do have rags to riches stories. They start out from professional backgrounds and so on. And so they come into wealth very early. Very often that means that it could mean one of two things. One is that they're better risk takers. They have more of a risk appetite in terms of how they invest, how they plan, and so on. They value professional advice more because they come from those backgrounds themselves. And very often it can also mean different things in terms of how they use their wealth. So we see philanthropy being a very strong area of focus for some of these tech families.
We talked about the third generation cycle in terms of wealth. First generation makes it, second generation maintains it, and the third generation loses it. Is this a phenomenon that you see in India, and is this a phenomenon of which people are aware and are planning for to ensure that they don't follow that particular path from the point of view of wealth preservation?
That being said, I think families are now starting to realize, because some patriarchs have passed away. And so we do have many second generation businesses which are transitioning into the third or fourth generation. So they are thinking about these issues, but what we don't have is the availability of a lot of precedent. So, to give you one example, there was this family a few years back that we were working with. And the patriarch had built a very, very successful business. He was a really sharp man. But like many patriarchs, he was also somebody who thought he had all the answers. He was not willing to listen. So he had put together this really beautiful, complex succession structure, which assumed that everybody in the family would be working like clockwork. And we were sitting in a room and trying to give it form as lawyers. And at some point we realized that the older son of the patriarch, who was supposed to sort of step into the business, was not engaging at all. And when we pulled him aside and had a chat with him, we realized he had no intentions of joining the business. He actually wanted to be an artist. He was too afraid to tell his father this. And so, there was this elaborate plan that was being constructed without, any sort of heed being paid to something as critical as that. A lot of voices who used to be silent voices at one period of time are now becoming increasingly involved in some of these conversations. So daughters, for example, you didn't see a lot of them even as recently as 20 years ago. The more extended family, so sons-in-law, daughters-in-law, nephews, nieces, so on, essentially folks who may be very operationally capable, but were not being involved in the business for whatever reason. So now I think families are becoming much more open-minded about all of that.
Interesting. I mean, it's a phenomenon which is quite similar in not only just in based out of Singapore, but also in other countries, that sometimes it skips a generation, sometimes it reaches out to very distant members of the family. A good friend of mine ended up running a family bank, even though he's a second cousin 5 times removed. But he was deemed to be the most capable of that generation.
I think the most important thing in these conversations is really the process, right? So the first thing we tell families is you're not going to get it perfect on day one. And then they say, then what are you here for? Unfortunately, I can't guarantee them personal results, perfect results on day one either. But what initiating this conversation does, and what initiating it in an open-minded fashion does, is it clears the air. You have sunlight as a disinfectant, right? So a lot of things that would have possibly come out much later come out earlier, because families are now forcing these issues into sort of being crystallized early on, and that I think is hugely positive. It wasn't very common, even as recently as 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah. So does that therefore mean that not only in India, but perhaps also elsewhere, that when you're working with clients, there's a requirement to encourage people to build an element of flexibility into whatever structures they create in order to cope with the unexpected?
Sorry to jump in, but I think that's the most critical thing.
Yeah.
Law, regulation, financials, everything else really pales into insignificance. But we're now dealing with a world that's an increasingly uncertain world. It's more uncertain today than it was 15 years ago. Things are changing so quickly. And I think if a structure is so rigid that it isn't able to adapt to that and adapt to changing family aspirations, it's doomed at the outset. You have very bizarre conversations sometimes. So, for example, this one family came to me and wanted to set up a trust that would last forever. They said, we've made enough money for ourselves and we want to ensure that all of our future generations are protected. And so we want to give out enough maintenance related distributions to each generation, but not more than that. And then the question was, how do we identify what is sufficient for maintenance? And they said, oh, we'll do a net present value of whatever we are looking at in the future, and that's how we're going to do it. But then the question that I asked them was, how do we know what that's going to be? I mean, it has to be a formula that's at least reasonably dynamic. Because, for example, if food security becomes a problem due to climate change, which is a conversation that is happening today, then the
Yeah.
cost of food could be 10 times, 20 times, or 100 times what it is today. So if you start off with a fixed number and say that I'm going to take X number of dollars today and apply inflation, and that's what you're going to get, that may simply not work. That became one of the most crucial sort of turning points to that structure, other than the fact that you can't set up perpetual trusts in India, just to clarify.
Tell us a little bit more about those silent voices. I mean, I think that's an interesting idea and concept. And as I say, it's certainly the case that in other jurisdictions, you do find extended members of the family coming in. But silent voices, obviously daughters and so forth, particularly in Asia, where patriarchal societies have tended to have a big sway. And now that's changing so that it doesn't automatically go to the eldest son. But how is that developing in India? And do you think that there are specialist structures that are used in India relative to anywhere else to deal with this or not?
Until 2005, Hindu undivided family distributions were only required to be made to co-parceners, who were essentially the male members of the family, the male descendants down the male line. In 2005, the Supreme Court passed a ruling, and there were also state legislations to this effect previously. But at a central level, the Supreme Court passed a ruling that daughters and sons were equal co-parceners and therefore had to get a distribution in whatever was held in the HUF. A lot of businesses were historically set up under HUFs due to tax planning reasons. And so when this judgment came about, it sort of, threw a lot of families into a tizzy because they didn't know what to do with this. But that's an example of the law sort of bringing in a change. I think what we've started seeing in the last 10 years, 15 years or so, and in fact, as recently as yesterday, I was sitting with a family where every time I meet them, both the husband and wife sit in on that meeting. And the first time I saw this, I said, oh, wow, this is, I love that this is happening, because this is a very traditional sector, tier 4 town, I would say, not even a tier 3 town in India. So not cosmopolitan city. And yet you have the wife taking equal decision-making responsibility, if not more, which I think is quite special. And I think families are changing in those ways as well. So because they're becoming smaller, and because the second gen is becoming educated, you often have situations where the daughter would have gone outside, studied, gone to business school, come back, and is very often more capable than the son is, and more interested than the son is.
That obviously brings up the case study of yourself. So a lady who's been off to Harvard Law School, doing a PhD at Oxford, you're now running your own business. And how personally have you found it as a female lawyer in India, now running your own business? Do you find that there are obstacles in your way, or that you're thriving despite the obstacles, or maybe even able to turn those obstacles to your advantage?
There are always obstacles, Steve. It doesn't matter if you're in India or what. Entrepreneurship is a constant hustle, and no one knows that better than you, right?
Yeah.
I was working for a diamond family, very traditional sector. And I remember going for a meeting with the promoter and the CFO many years ago, almost 10 years ago. And when I walked in, the promoter wasn't there yet. And he was the person who had been dealing with primarily. The CFO, who had never dealt with me, was there, and he must have been a 45-year-old gentleman or so. I walked in with two of my associates who were both really young. They were at least 7 or 8 years less experienced than me, but they were both 6 feet tall. And so the CFO assumed they were my bosses. And so every time I would direct a question to him, he would respond to one of them. And one of them got so embarrassed that he started addressing all of his responses to me. So we were having this strange triangular conversation for a really long time. And then the promoter walks in and he comes and shakes my hand first. And in 10 seconds, Steve, this person's entire attitude changes. Like, it's like the last 10 minutes just didn't happen.
When you were growing up, what sort of grounding did your parents and your father give you? Did you decide that you wanted to be a lawyer earlier on because your parents were pushing you in that direction, or how did they view you and your career ambitions going forward?
I never thought I would be a lawyer.
What did you think you were going to be?
I was all set to be, I had my heart set on journalism. And I think law happened, it was a combination of factors, but I still remember the day I decided to go to law school. One of my grandmothers called up my mother from another city saying, "Don't let the girl do law. She'll become so argumentative, nobody will want to marry her."
And what was it that led you to Harvard?
Again, I never thought Harvard was in my destiny. I was not a very strong student in law school. I was not the sort of person who was acing classes and getting great grades and things like that. I did discover some areas of law that I had a deep passion for. So I started off as a tax lawyer. Tax is still my first love, in spite of all the conversations that we've been having on the private client side. And so Harvard was really a way to explore the possibilities of what a theoretical sort of exploration of the subject could give. That's how it started off. But I think what I came away with at the end of the program was really the networks. Because it's a very small cohort. I think they take about 150 students a year in their master's program. And they come from, I think, 40, 50 odd countries. It's a very, very diverse group. And so the kinds of people you end up meeting and the kinds of backgrounds that they've come from are very, very illuminating.
You decided not to stay in the United States. Your intention was always to come back to India.
Yes. And there's nothing that strips you of that notion quicker than standing in a bunch of 60 kids who have no fear in asking you all sorts of questions. So I would recommend it thoroughly to everybody.
It sounds absolutely terrifying. You've recently gone out into business on your own. Why did you do that? And what are your aspirations? Where do you see your practice going over the next 10 years?
So thank you for that question. I've actually thought a lot about it. Prior to setting up, I did work with 2 tier 1 firms for a very long period of time. And there were certain things about the way in which legal practices work which irked me very deeply. The first is, I think that at least for certain kinds of areas, there needs to be a deeper engagement with academics in order for you to be a good advisor in those areas, but also as your way of giving back. I wanted to see if it was possible to create an organizational push for something like that. I also think that things like pro bono obligations are things that are not institutionalized as adequately as they should be, and that's something that I want to try and make happen. On the professional side, I think there is a space for boutique private client advisory in India. So unlike in the UK and in Europe, where private client firms are increasingly boutique, in India, they still sit nestled within larger tier 1 outfits. What that means is that you're working with a promoter and you're probably billing him like, I don't know, $2,000 for some piecemeal advice, but he's been coming to you for 20 years. But he's now competing with the M&A transaction where you're billing $100,000. And obviously, the two are never going to get the same kind of attention. And this sort of came out of a conversation with a family and again, a family that I've been working with for more than 10 years, where he said, Shreya, when I call you up, I don't want to be on the clock. And I have enough people to give me advice. And he showed me his table and he said, see, I have a PPM that someone has sent me. I have a shareholders agreement that someone has sent me. I have all of these documents, but I need to look at these documents. I don't have the time or the inclination to do that. And I need someone to advise me on the risk. So it's been a very essential change in role where, even though I continue to work with them, it's now a greater position of responsibility. I don't service everything internally. If there are specialist areas that I don't deal with, so if it's a patent dispute, for example, I know nothing about it. Divorce matters, I don't do at all, but I will get it done for them.
you talked a little bit about wanting to give back in your own practice. We talked a little bit about traditional patterns of philanthropy for wealthy families, but how do you see that developing over the next decade in India, and how does old versus new money view philanthropic activity?
So this is an area very close to my heart, Steve. And I think also an area that is going to see some amount of innovation in the future. So, the older models of philanthropy, and we do have some large business houses in the past who've been very, very actively involved in philanthropy. The Tatas and the Birlas are good examples. And the way in which they functioned is, they would typically set up schools, or they would set up hospitals, or they would, essentially do certain kinds of things which were good for the community as a whole, alongside the businesses that they were running. And so it was a sort of a question of, how do I make this space that I'm working with, how do I sort of improve living standards and in the interest of everybody who's in this space. I think what is different about some of the new generation philanthropy is that it's a lot more considered. They think more deeply about impact, and how impact is being evaluated. They are not afraid to experiment across sectors. So it's no longer health and education. They do fund a lot of different kinds of causes.
Shreya, we could probably talk on for hours and hours, but if we're going to sort of wrap up with one point or a couple of points that you wanted to make, talking about the way that private wealth is operating in India, and how you, as a specialist service provider, advisor, operates within that, what would it be?
I think the single most important thing when it comes to, at least the way I work with families on the private wealth side, is what you're trying to do in terms of personal planning can be as simple or as complex as you want it to be. I'm a huge believer in simplicity. So I don't think families should be setting up trusts or multiple layers of entities or what have you, unless there's a very good reason for them doing that. Very often when they give you their reasons, they don't hold up to scrutiny. And so if you're willing to interrogate those reasons, you will find very often that those layers are not required. I think increasingly personal planning is less and less about tax planning. If taxes are foreseeable and if they're predictable, families will factor them in as a cost. What they value more is flexibility. What they value more is certainty and security.
Thank you very much, Shreya. It's been a fascinating 45 minutes or so. Really enjoyed our conversation. I think we probably need to set up a volume 2 for our next conversation, because this is, as is always the case, as I've discovered when talking to you, leads to yet more questions and more interesting insights. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And we'll see you very soon.